Ladies and gentlemen, good morning from Ioannina. I thank you very much, the organizers, for including me in this conference. It is a great honor for me. St. Justin Popovich reminds us that the Christian Orthodox response to the challenges of classical humanism is the practical experience of Christocentric theanthropism, or God-manhood. If you want, we can find this also in the literature. However, although Renaissance humanism has its roots in the humanist contact with ancient Greek texts, pagan late antiquity, especially the philosophical current of Neoplatonism, developed another model of God-manhood. This proposal has similarities and differentiations from the Christian alternative. What is more, both can be seen as an answer to the contemporary discussion concerning posthumanism. Although, as I will show, the Christian answer is more complete compared to its pagan equivalent. In this paper, I will examine two versions of the dialectics between divine and human love. First, the model of Plato's Socrates, as is presented by the most systematic representative of Neoplatonism, Proclus, who lived in the 5th century AD. And second, the model of Christ as it is presented in the Areopagitic writings. These writings form a corpus written at some point in late 5th or early 6th century AD. The author calls himself by the name of St. Paul's convert, Dionysius the Areopagite, although various verbal and conceptual similarities with the works of Proclus have not remained hidden. The dialectics I'm interested in focuses on the concept of unmixed or undefiled providence, amictipronia. In what follows, I will show that a careful reading of the Areopagite can help us realize a subtle but important differentiation between the pagan and the Christian version of unmixed providence. The juxtaposition of these two modi vivendi is relevant to our era facing the unprecedented evolution of artificial intelligence. Such questions have been also treated by Father Brandon Gallagher in a paper entitled God-manhood versus man-godhood, an Eastern Orthodox response to transhumanism. I'm not going to delve into the discussion as to what exactly the differentiation is, if any, between transhumanism and posthumanism. What humanity needs to avoid in this procedure is the characteristic trait of ancient Greek tragedy, hubris, which is similar to the fall we witness in Old Testament's Genesis. So, the historical attempt of abolishing the centrality of God, centrality which characterizes the pre-modern era in its medieval scholastic version, led to another type of God's centrality, or apotheosis of the individual. St. Justin Popovich would say that the problem in all these cases is the lack of Christ's centrality, Christocentricity. However, Dionysius the Areopagite was an authority for the scholastic thinkers whose God-centricity was debunked by the Renaissance humanists who proposed a return to the humanism of Greek and Latin antiquity. Nevertheless, is it true that God-centricity, in fact, God-manhood, theanthropism, is absent from ancient Greek culture? Proclus' oeuvre, translated in part by Marsilio Ficino, gives the possibility of tracing not only God-centricity, but also a form of God-manhood. Consequently, Dionysius' dialogue with ancient Greek tradition, as this is preserved in Proclus' work, is not that of a direct conflict or total negation. To the contrary, Dionysius hints to the need of completing the truth hidden in ancient wisdom, even if this truth is in the end apophatic, and despite the necessary disagreements and corrections included in the dialogical procedure. This ironic attitude, which is nonetheless oriented toward the quest for truth as a divine name of Christ, should characterize, I believe, also the contemporary dialogue about posthumanism. So, Christ's incarnation might be clear to us to an extent that a mystery within church can be known, but what is exactly the pagan undefiled providence? For a lucid exposition, we can turn to the central proposition 122 of Proclus' Elements of Theology. Quote, all that is divine both exercise providence towards secondary existences and transcends the beings for which it provides. its providence involves no remission of its pure and unitary transcendence, neither does its separate unity annul its providence. End of quote. One of the significant contributions of this proposition is its explanation as to how divine providence can be made compatible with the other fundamental Greek assumption about gods, their transcendence. Indeed, as also E.R. Dodds notes, the gist of the Epicurean criticism against the idea of gods being providential for what lies beneath them was that it, quote, credits the gods with an interest in an infinity of petty problems and so abolishes their transcendence and makes their life laborious and tiresome, end of quote. However, for the Neoplatonic successor, Proclus, the special glory of Platonism, as Proclus calls it, consists in the preservation of both divine transcendence and providence. In other words, if the hyperbeing of the gods entails both the fact of their transcendence as well as their providential attitude towards the inferiors, then thinking with the Epicureans that providence pollutes divine transcendence or eudaimonia is not the right way. Rather, there can be a compromise between these two fundamental divine aspects, and this solution is realized in the concept of asketos and amygis pronia, i.e., a providence that assumes no relation with its recipients, making the gods undefiled and pure from anything lower to them. Thus, the paradox of divine providence, as Proclus calls it, emerges, since it is a kind of causal relation of the divine with the lower reality without there being any actual relation or interference between them at all. Elsewhere, while treating Proclus' erotic doctrines in his commentary on the first Alcibiades, one of my central points of reference was Socrates, whose presence is frequent in Proclus. I showed that Socrates' loving relations help us to understand the intelligible divine relations, and that ultimately Socrates is an expression, albeit an attenuated one, of the divine in our world. In other words, Socrates is an intramundane ideal of how to exercise undefiled providence on his own body or toward Alcibiades. On the other hand, Dionysius' Christian counterpoint to Socrates, whose attainable ideal of our life is Christ. The parallel between Socrates as foreshadowing Christ has been long ago noted. As I show elsewhere, Christ's traces in Dionysius' work, although admittedly faint, not only help us to understand what divine eros is, but owing to a reading that foreshadows Maximus the Confessor, they form its best exemplification. Hence, the cardinal difference between the two figures is that Christ is not just a micro expression of the divine in our world, but actually God Himself. Thus, on a first reading, Dionysius differs completely from Proclus in this respect. The incarnate Christ is a clear anomaly, not only for the Neoplatonic system of Proclus, but for the whole of ancient Greek philosophy, if indeed the death on the cross has been characterized by St. Paul as scandal for the Jews and foolishness for the Greeks. Furthermore, even if Socrates was said to provide for other souls, as well as for his own body, we have seen that according to the Neoplatonic ideal of undefiled providence, the divine principles exercise providence without any intermingling with or embodiment in the recipient of providence. Socrates forms a marginal case where, in order to exercise providence, he had to descend to the earthly realm, while the undefiled part of his care meant, e.g., abstinence from sexual relations. By contrast, the quintessence of Christ's philanthropy, i.e., the loving providence of the uncreated first principle, is that he descended to created mankind, quote, so that we may be made God, end of quote, in the famous words of St. Athanasius. Christian God's loving ecstasy or kenosis means intermingling with the beloved. Yet, Dionysius' language is very close to Proclus. First of all, without reference to incarnation, Dionysius uses the Proclean vocabulary of divine transcendence and undefiled providence. I choose the following example taken from outside the section on love because it connects the two aforementioned themes. Quote, the divinity is described as omnipotent because he has power over all and is in control of the world in an unmixed way, because he is the goal of all yearning or love, and because he lays a happy yoke on all who wish it, the sweet toil of that holy, omnipotent and indestructible yearning for his goodness. End of quote. This may seem unremarkable, when trying to capture the nature of the first principle, both Neoplatonism and Christianity are bound to assert deity's super-transcendence. But even in the case of the incarnate first principle, i.e. Christ, who has taken human flesh, Dionysius' language is similar. Again, quote, "The divinity of Jesus is the being pervading all beings and remains unaffected thereby. It is the supra-being beyond every being. In all this, he remains what he is, supernatural, transcendent, and he has come to join us in what we are without himself undergoing change or confusion." End of quote. A reader who has read Proclus and is unfamiliar with the significance that church fathers ascribe to Christ would think that Christ performs undefiled providence just as Proclus and Socrates does. If so, these passages would mean that for Dionysius, incarnation is a secondary issue, because what primarily counts is God's divine transcendence above his creation. On this monophysitizing reading, which some interpreters want to adopt, God would not intermingle with the objects of its providence. However, due to the undeniable Dionysian resources regarding Christ, especially in chapters 210 of the Divine Names and 3.3 of the Ecclesiastical Hierarchy, I think we can have an alternative proposal. Instead of thinking that Dionysius reproduces Proclus' ideal of undefiled providence, adding to this mixture Christ. Here, we may take note of an ancient comment, which is with certainty ascribed to Maximus the Confessor, on another paradoxical Dionysian enunciation reminiscent of undefiled providence. In one of the succinct chapters on Eros, supposedly by St. Hierotheus, the author speaks of God as the ascetos idea pandos erotos, the unrelated cause of all love. The paradox, as with Proclus' undefiled providence, is that if eros is a relational term, how can its bearer be ascetos, i.e. non-related with its object of love? Maximus answers, quote, "By asceton, Dionysius means the absolute, of which there is no relation with the all, i.e. there is no natural affinity of the absolute with the all." End of quote. The absence of intermingling between lover and beloved means that the two are fundamentally different, not soul and body, as in the case of Socrates, but uncreated and created in the language of the ecumenical councils. Hence, Dionysius could retain this formula when referring even to Christ, because although he is one hypostasis, which is constituted from two natures, there is no confusion between them. Christ's incarnation is not the same as Socrates' embodiment. The fact that Christ has received a total humanity shows why God is a manic lover, while Socrates' undefiled providence denotes his failure when compared with higher demons or divinities. Were he higher soul, he would not need to be incarnate or educate Alcibiades. The result is that whereas Socrates can elevate his body or Alcibiades only up to the divine point he has reached, Christ takes the whole man and hence the whole creation up to the highest level, i.e., in himself. In conclusion, when the French biologist Jean Rostand declared during the 20th century that, quote, "Science has made us gods even before we are worthy of being men," end of quote, I do not think he was thinking about the orthodox understanding of theosis, deification, qua Christification. Even if we employed the pagan Neoplatonic criteria I expounded above, his formulation remains imprecise. If in the roots of a humanism that in the end killed God along with our fellow humans, there lies a notion of theanthropism or God-manhood, able to be in dialogue with the mystery of Christ's incarnation, then let us employ this as the criterion par excellence for our debates about posthumanism, so that it can mean not the death of mankind, but its resurrection. Thank you very much.